Well, welcome to this session in a series called The Reference Desk, and it's the 20th of February of 2022. I might just say at the beginning of this session, which will introduce Steven Kolins, the idea of this series is that scholarship has always been supported by libraries, catalogues, bibliographies, specialized dictionaries, etc., chronologies, many other types of reference services. And for a very long time, these services were only available to those who could get into the major libraries in their city or country. And so it was quite an elite practice, particularly if you look over the millennia. Access to historical materials was quite a privileged thing. But in the internet age, we have new technologies and new possibilities for being in touch. And the processes of research and publication are still being modified by these new technologies. And there's a whole range of these technologies that are informing Baha'i research. And there's very many people who are starting to engage in exploring these. And that's what this series is all about. I'm just going to add, before I introduce Steve, a little anecdote about my own journey here. When I was a young researcher, I found a book on information management, and it explained 8 key information actions, and that we create information, we change it, we store it, we retrieve it, we integrate it, we make decisions using it, we communicate those decisions, and we discard information. And as a young researcher, I thought, well, how hard can this be to find information and store it and use it? I eventually reduced these 8 information actions to 4. We find information, we store it, we retrieve it, and we use it. And now, of course, we may discard it as well, but that's more like some archivists and librarians discard, but a lot of researchers find ways to store. So using that simple 4-step process is actually a very complex matter. How do we find? How do we store? How do we retrieve? And how do we use? And those who are using large-scale data sets, whether it's numeric or whether it's text, the more text you collect, the harder it is to find that needle in a haystack. So these are very complex processes, and this series is about how in the digital age we find, store, retrieve, and use. And those 4 processes are also linked to the turbulent changes that have come to the process of what does it mean to research? What does it mean to write? What does it mean to edit? What does it mean to print, which is related to publish? They're not the same thing. What does it mean to distribute? And all these questions are now up for consideration because the classic models of being a writer who gets published have changed. And that's what this series is also all about. Many years ago, I came across the name of Steven Kolins. He seemed to be everywhere on the internet, sharing documentation about Baha'i history and biography and other matters. And so we came into touch, and I found that he has a very interesting story to tell. And so Steven's path in the use of these new technologies is part of the impetus for this series, because I thought people like Steven haven't had a chance to tell his story, how it started, what he's doing, where it's going. And so I'm delighted that today we can have a session with Steven so he can answer these questions for us. So Steven, I'd like to welcome you to the session and start off by asking a little bit about your background and maybe where you grew up or where you're living now, and then if we'll get into how you got involved in computing issues. So welcome, Steven, and over to you.
Thank you, thank you. I grew up kind of in scattered places, kind of settled into Wisconsin in the United States, And my first sort of academic foray was earning a Bachelor of Science with double majors, physics and philosophy, and double minors, psychology and math. So you might get a sense that I'm a little bit of an overachiever. Simultaneously, I was president of the philosophy club and the physics club. And then actually I was an officer of the secular humanist club. And the same year I joined the Baha'i faith and gave up some of these other things. Computers were present, but hardly a big part of my life at that point. This was the 1970s into the 80s. And there were computers in my high school, but we weren't using them for this kind of stuff. In the 90s, I moved to North Carolina, pursued getting a master's in physics with a minor in science education, which was, I'm trying to think of what field I was going to go into and that kind of thing. Didn't really have a clear path figured out. I got married, started just getting menial jobs. But again, I worked for a food chain and I eventually became the highest hourly paid employee in the business in the state. And I was training managers in how to do their job. But when they asked me if I would like to become a manager, I was like, no way, I'm not interested. Around that time, literally someone gave me a computer. And then another person, a friend of mine, gave me a modem. This is the dial-up age. And I began to explore what was called bulletin board systems, BBSs. And my first online conversation was about racism and whether it was natural and appropriate, or in trying to fight that understanding, seeking out networks of computers that called each other, discussing religion, thinking that if you just quoted the writings and you were sincere in your presentation, that would be convincing to people, and discovering that not remotely were they convinced. But over time, there was a bridge of understanding that began to grow. But really about the time we began to make some headway, the internet came along and totally dismissed the technology. All of the innovations that had come along that way went away. I will say that I've summarized some of this kind of background information in a Baha'i World volume, volume 20. And I'll briefly share my screen just to show that it exists here. However, you have to deal with the fact that my name was misspelled. Here it is. Bill Kolins actually posted it in his Scriptum series. So it exists out there. And again, there's URLs that can be spotted later for people who want to look it up. But BBSs are described a little bit in there, different people using it. The primary difference between the BBS age and the internet age is that on the BBSs, your fundamental ability to participate was tied to your phone number. So your identity was fixed, believe it or not. So if you violated a discussion area protocol, rules of civility, they could actually block you, and they could actually keep you out or mute you, or you could read but not post or whatever. But when the internet came along, that pretty much disappeared. And I tried to participate in religion discussion areas, but I found it just too hard to participate. There were trolling going on before the word was even a term. And so I gave up on a lot of that. And in trying to find something to do, I tripped across Wikipedia. And this was around maybe a little before 2005. You can look up histories. Everything's recorded somewhere in Wikipedia. The farther back you go, it's a little hard to find the actual links, but if you're pursuing it, or you download the whole thing, you can trace it all back. My very first attempt at an article was actually on the outer solar system. It wasn't on Baha'i topics. That got smushed because the person at the time thought I was going off the reservation of how many sources are available to talk about it. So he got rid of it. My first surviving article is the Baha'i Faith in Fiction article, which has certainly gotten hairy since then. And I've been told there have been other people who've done their own little presentations on dimensions of the faith in various sci-fi and fantasy novels and poems and stories and things. I was trying to find a way to make a difference in Baha'i articles, but a tremendous amount of work had already been done, and I would tweak something or something, but not a lot was really apparent to do. But then I was actually reading in Wikipedia about the Religion in Australia article, which is its own article. And in Wikipedia, you can post not only the change you want to make, but you can make a comment about the change. And then there's also a talk page. I'm not going to go into all the details about it, but there's ways contributors, or as we call them, editors, can talk to each other as well as actually make the changes they want. And my memory is that there was an exchange going on between a person working on Sikhism in Australia and someone more concerned about the whole page, the whole article, and not wanting to unbalance the article with too much content or misleading content. And they were talking to each other, and they were literally arguing about whether the section should be, if my memory, 2 sentences or 3 sentences. And the person minding the whole page, according to my memory, suggested to the person doing this entry and trying to argue for 3, go write your own article on Sikhism in Australia, and you can come back and just link that exists and come back to the Religion in Australia article. And that was my second big holy cow moment. I literally had goosebumps. My scalp kind of crawled. I got shivers. Holy cow, this is huge. This is huge. Because I had been familiar by going around and tweaking little bits, I knew enough from the section about the temple. I believe there was a reference to, I believe it's pronounced the Yerenbul Baha'i School. I'm not sure that's the right pronunciation, but there was a Baha'i school in Australia. And then the Duns were mentioned in an article. I could literally just copy sections and paste it into an article, and I would have the beginning of a Baha'i Faith in Australia article with no original work really whatsoever, just copying from other articles that already existed. And that's what I did. And then I began like, well, let's go find things. Around the same time, and you can go back and find some of these links in Wikipedia if you know where to look, you can start finding some of these exchanges and when articles started and that kind of stuff. But as I began to invest in really doing this and thinking about the fact that there are 200 countries, provinces and states where there might be a lot of written material about the Baha'i faith in New York or whatever, Paris, and then as I'm looking at this, around the same time, copies of Baha'i News and Baha'i World had been somewhat circulated online. And I say somewhat because I would download them, be able to search, go back and build a reference that points back to it so people can rely that I'm not just making this up, which is verification is an important quality to Wikipedia. I would use that source, and then that place would go down and they wouldn't have it or anymore. And so that became an ongoing challenge, which I'll come back to it later. But as I learned more sources, I would go through a wave of moving from article to article and then going back to the Religion in Baha'i Faith in Australia article, revising it, adding new materials as I was able to find it. And I'd carry on, and then I'd go for a while and learn some technique, how to build a citation or some new source or whatever, and how to change things, or I'd learn how to make a table. So I'd come back to the Religion in Baha'i Faith in Australia article, update it. So if you go to the article and go through the history, you'll see me repeat at times in there and do massive re-edits and extensions. And that's kind of your marker of waves of me doing this kind of thing. I was aiming to do a 4th revision about that when the project in general had gotten so large, different things going on in my life, I kind of stopped. I stopped at a point where the newspaper coverage in Australia had really become available. And I had collected actually a ton of articles, but it was so massive a collection that I didn't know how to digest it down. So I was like sort of wowed by the amount of information and how to make sense of it to tell the story. So I kind of stopped. I actually tried to get other people involved to see if they could continue, which is another point I'm going to come back to. But let me go ahead and talk a little bit about me in Wikipedia. Just to say again, this is really me. So this is me. The point of this is not to do a biography or anything. This is for editors mostly. Anyone can see this. But editors in Wikipedia, if they see me contributing to an article and they want a quick view of who I am, mostly the information on the right side, not so much the information on the left, it's pretty old. Some other things that have been noted about me. I did a bunch of articles that got noted at some point or other. And then for every user page, there's also a talk page. So people leaving messages for me, talking about different things. There's different kinds of comments of various kinds in there. So there's that. In terms of where I am in the overall architecture of Wikipedia, I wouldn't say that I'm remarkable. This page coming up is the number of your position in the list of 41 million people who've ever contributed to Wikipedia. Where do you rank? And I'm somewhere in the 2400th position. Do a quick search. There I am, 2379 at the moment, which is, it's something, but it's not anything terribly extraordinary. There are lots of other editors in there. So there's the number of edits. You can see I've got 41,000 edits saved somewhere in Wikipedia. There are also lists of how many articles. I won't go into it. If somebody wants to look it up, you can look it up. How many articles. Very broadly, I tend to write long articles and fewer of them. Nevertheless, I have, because of these country articles, written something like 130, 140 articles in Wikipedia. And that has kept me busy. And I have tried to share this occasionally with Baha'is. And occasionally I get sort of feedback. And so switching gears to the experience of Wikipedia as a source that people are using, my first real experience was about 2007-ish, somewhere in there. I went into a Baha'i center and someone was giving a presentation. And one of my projects before really diving into the countries had been finding any famous Baha'i and making sure that they had been noted as a Baha'i in the Wikipedia article about them. I wasn't really adding new articles on people at that point. And I walked into this Baha'i Center presentation about famous African-American Baha'is. And very literally, my words were up on the screen that someone else was presenting. And that was the first time I really saw that the public was picking up on this, that people noticed this was out there somewhere. When I walked in, nobody knew who I was. I mean, they knew me individually because I'm in the community, but there wasn't any kind of like moment of stop and like it was just Steven's in the room. Okay, he's sitting down. There was no knowledge to speak of that I was involved in Wikipedia. And I think that's one of the challenges of Wikipedia for authors and writers and scholars is there's no copyright. There's no claim to fame. There are other Wikipedia contributors who came and did tremendous work before I came along, but you're going to have a hard time finding them because almost everybody didn't use their real names. I'm one of the few people that did. But I've been keeping busy. around that time, I was going to show you this. This is a sense of some more sense of the reach of Wikipedia. This is a page views analysis that's out. It's got to come up and fill. And I'm going to set it to logarithmic scale. And you can see this is only set to users. In fact, let me pop up my little focus. Here's its users, but on all platforms. And the data goes back to 2015. And you can see basically there's a bunch of peaks. The high one is about 50,000 back to 2015. I will say that if you can dig for the data, I believe in 2012, there's a peak of around 60,000. Broadly speaking, I would say that these are somehow related to news coverage of events. So for example, the 2012 one, I'm pretty sure is related to the coverage of the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting and the memorial service that was held. And they mentioned the Baha'is, and there was a prayer read from the Baha'is. This one, I believe, is a body of a Baha'i youth that was found many years after he had disappeared, and it made the news a fair bit. So some of this information is occurring for various reasons, and you get down to 10,000 and there's more and more peaks. Occasionally there looks like there's some kind of wave of an issue, something going on. There's plenty of data out here for someone to do an analysis if they really want to. I'm just glossing over sort of the basics of it. We'll see what happens in time, what if things happen. I also wanted to show, and I'm shifting now to more of a Bahaipedia focus. I had started in Bahaipedia in 2012. This is the statistics system that they have for broad traffic type things. You'll have to talk to David about getting access if you want to do any kind of analysis. But broadly speaking, there's some waves of traffic, some peaks of traffic. Sometimes it's low, sometimes it's high. You have to do your own analysis to get an understanding of what's going on, how much data actually gets transferred different ways. There's that. And then to show that I am in Bahaipedia, this is my Bahaipedia page, which I had no interest in showing off anything. There was no reason for me to say, well, this is who I am and why I do things, or how many things I've done or anything. But I have done 270 articles as they stand right now. All of these ends refer to a new article, and you'll see some of these are sandbox, but I'm counting the ones that are actually named articles of some kind or other. And they're usually newspaper related coverage, though sometimes they're biographies. And this also reflects, I was referring to this time where I wasn't able to go back to the Australia article as much. Some of that was because while I have a worldwide interest in the faith and I'm trying to present this material, some of my focus has also occasionally come down to the state level, because the history of the faith in North Carolina, where I'm living, wasn't well spoken of, well on everybody's lips. So I was beginning to do some focus on North Carolina coverage. So if you go to Bahaipedia and look for my articles, you'll see a lot of them are based on North Carolina, but not all of them. There's a variety of ones. One of the ones I'm working on right now is an analysis of the 10-year crusade inside the country. There's piles and piles, books and books about the international aspects of the 10-year crusade. But to the best of my knowledge, no one's written about the 10-year crusade effect inside the country. And this comes up because while the first assembly of North Carolina is relatively known, the fact that a bunch of others were formed in the 1950s is far less clear. They're known historically, but why were they formed is not identified. And the fact that they were actually goal cities, for example. Let's see. So I mentioned that especially with Bahaipedia, I began to work into newspapers more. So I want to mention that. And I'm aware that Bill Kolins is on this call, and in his marvelous bibliography, and also in Mujan Momin's book, Contemporary Western Accounts, they both mention the first newspaper mention of the Baha'i faith, but then they both clearly just state that they can't cover all of the newspapers. So I began looking for sources that I could use in Wikipedia and also in Bahaipedia to talk about the faith without using Baha'i sources, fundamentally, just that something had happened at a conference or someone had given a talk. And I began doing clippings. And you can see here, I've got over 49,000 clippings on this website, newspapers.com. And I've collected in other places as well, in just about every state in the US, and I think every state in Australia, Canada. It's less available, last I looked, but there's different places around every country is now beginning to have digitized collections of newspapers. And a number of things have really popped up from this kind of search. And I'm going to mention a couple of them. One of them, the first one that really happened for me, is that first newspaper article from 1845 that is pretty well known, has been published in the Baha'i journals since the 1970s. Turns out to have been published, I'm pretty comfortable to say, in every single county of the British Isles, and in every English-speaking country of the world. And that was not known by any Baha'i scholars that I know of before around 2013 or so. And tabulating that is an ongoing effort, and I believe it's beginning to show up in other languages now. I think that's important to note. I did collect a few of these in an early Baha'i library collection that I made specifically just to have them available. And of course, you can't read that right now, but those are all versions of that first newspaper column that appeared. And the amount of information in them not only varies by length, but in quality as well. And there's information in what I would call the second one that nobody had collected that I know of, that added a line of information that was not in the first line. So there's new things to be found, is what I'm saying. Another one that came along was a reference to Reverend Wright's paper from 1851, I believe it is. I was just clipping things from South Carolina, a state in the United States, and I saw this weird article. It was very specific, had lots of details, kind of long. It had kind of a weird slant on it. I didn't know what to make of it. I posted it to a discussion area with some other scholars, and they said, gee, that looks like the English version of a German paper. And I forgive me, I can't even come close to pronouncing it, but it's been known since the 1850s, 60s of various scholars. It's been known, I don't know how long, for decades and decades among Baha'i scholars as the first official paper on the Baha'i faith. However, it was only known in the German. And I believe, if I remember correctly, Mujan Momin in his Contemporary Western Accounts actually says it was never published in English. Well, here it was on the front page of an 1865 newspaper. And this is strange. Why is this paper on the article in the front page of an 1865, right after the Civil War? I have no idea why I still don't know why it's there. But now I had an actual phrase I could search, and I searched for the phrase, and I found one in Vermont in 1851. In fact, this one actually had the citation and let me track down the name of the publication, and I actually found the original publication. So I sent that off to the World Center, and I believe there's a copy of it on Baha'i Library. So that's another example of newspapers changing the dynamic of what we think we know. The third one I'm going to mention is the 1852-53 Slaughter of Bobbies that has been the object of a lot of scholarly investigations and some angst, because the Baha'i sources say this and the non-Baha'i sources say that, and what kind of evidence can we get? And this proved a big field of difference in the 1970s and 80s, I suppose. However, it turns out there are newspapers that talk about it live at the time. So if you go to British newspapers, newspaperarchive.co.uk, here in, let me click these away, here in November 1852, we're talking about 400 Bobbies being killed. This is public. You can do a search in this website and you can just have the results. You don't have to actually see the whole clipping, but you can see clearly there's mentions of a few of these articles, kind of the same language, but something's going on in November. And then if you go to December, another URL, and here's son of a gun, end of December, they're talking about 20 or 30,000. And I posted this and some discussion came about from it, but I don't know if the people involved in the 1980s paid any attention to this, but this is another source of information that kind of jumps in where people thought we had suffered through all of the sources possible. And we haven't. I will say that original English paper from Reverend Wright had an extra paragraph that was not in the German. And again, this has been posted to BahaiLibrary.com. And that led to an investigation that only very recently found more letters of Reverend Wright, which I can share later, but I wasn't going to show now. But I'm just saying this goes on. There's more and more, even of what people think of as deep history and everything's been known. We're not going to find anything new. No, we're finding new things. But I'm going to shift my focus now to talk more about what kind of challenges both in Wikipedia and Bahaipedia have come along. And I'm going to frame this referencing a quote to sort of talk about why this is all happening. You all should remember this. I'm sure many of you do. A mechanism of world intercommunication will be devised, embracing the whole planet, freed from national hindrances and restrictions, functioning with marvelous swiftness and perfect regularity. That's from, of course, Shoghi Effendi in 1936. And that really matters. This is underscoring a prediction way ahead of what is going on. And I think this is part of what's going on. The whole wave of digitization, the whole wave of people engaging in it individually, non-institutionally. I'm not here representing any institution. I have no membership in any institution. This is just me editing. And frankly, it could be any of you and should be any of you editing. A particular challenge is the stability of sources. And this kind of gets into the discussion of that Paul Lample makes in his, what was it called? Revelation in Social Reality. This is a website that quotes a talk of his, but he makes exactly the same point. Disciplines give rise to their own communities of practice. They have their own bodies of knowledge, standards, and methods where they explore and do things and have things. Baha'is who participate in such academic communities of practice are correct to point out that they are obliged to conform to the accepted range of methods, criteria, and truths. So the whole engagement of Wikipedia is an example of this kind of issue. So you're participating as a Wikipedia person, as a good faith contributor trying to find good sources. And the scholars that publish in journals, that's great. The newspaper journalists who write stories about these things, that's great. It all helps come into this. And we need that kind of effort. But there are still challenges. One of them is, and I'll stop sharing a moment, link rot, which is a term that didn't exist until not too long ago. And so you have a URL that goes to it, and there's your paper, there's your source. And then you later go back to that link and it doesn't work. And I want to point out a few cases of positive engagement about that, and mention just very generally that, yeah, it's still really a problem. The first one that I want to mention, and there's sort of sides to this, is Bahailibrary.com. Thank you, Jonah Winters. For those of you who haven't heard, of course, you've all heard of Bahailibrary.com, but at one point he had to change all of his software in such a way that all the URLs that you had broke. So a substantial footprint of links in Wikipedia broke. And as far as I can remember, on his own initiative, he went back into Wikipedia and found every single Bahailibrary.com link and fixed it. And I'm, bravo, sir. Thank you very much. A complementary version of the issue came up another way, and I'm going to share my screen again. The fact that Bahailibrary.com was showing up so much became a point of controversy in Wikipedia. They have a sort of in-house field of effort. Again, the URL will be shared later. Of an in-house field of effort to try to look for sites that gather information and then share it. And a lot of these people break copyright or hodgepodge things together and are garbage websites, garbage collection websites. And Bahailibrary.com got labeled and threatened as being one of these websites. So I had to go back. Well, anybody could, but I was able to find several papers that explicitly refer to Bahailibrary.com and several academic libraries that specifically endorsed using Bahailibrary.com. And as a result, we managed to save Bahailibrary.com's reputation inside Wikipedia. So that's an important moment. And it happened 3 years ago, 2 months and 19 days. So that's a good story of preserving links, fixing link rot problems. There's a couple others. Bahai.org, for example, they had an old reference library and a new reference library for the current version of materials. And if you went to an old, they've changed their website quite significantly, but the old links, as far as I've been able to run into, they all still work. They land you on exactly where they used to be. If you manually try to find them, you land in the new one unless you can really know where you're going. But the automatic old links still work. So bravo, Bahai.org. Thank you very much. That's an important achievement that is not universal. When I started using newspapers.com, they have occasionally the challenge of a not very good looking scan of a page. And so they go back and replace the page in their system and you get the new version. Well, for a while, they were very politely sending you a copy of your clipping and then the URL was broken. So I kind of howled about that. And initially they ignored me. And then I started posting on their Facebook page saying, look, you're killing off thousands of my clippings. I can't, this is terrible. What are you doing to me? Well, they retooled. And now if you hit a URL that goes to a replaced page, the clipping is still there. There's a little thing across the top that says this page has been replaced by a new version. Oh, but the link works. So bravo, newspapers.com. Thank you very much. So that's one sort of challenge. Of course, there are examples where things do break and then they have to be fixed manually. I will say that Wikipedia itself actually innovated an effort. If archive.org has a copy of that web page, which isn't universal, but has a lot of, they have a robot or a script that will look at the dead URL, see if one exists on archive.org and automatically put it in. So that's a good thing. I wish we had more of that. There are definitely cases where we do have link rot problems though. Another problem that might seem trivial at some level is URL language. So if you can see, it's a little small, but there's this sort of accent things and that kind of stuff. But the exact syntax, and I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste this, and I'm sorry if this is going to be a little small, but you should be able to see that that's basically a mess.
No, Stephen, no, you're going to share screen, right?
Oh, sorry. Yep. Where is my Zoom? I've got too many screens going on. There we are. Lost track of what I was doing. There we go. Actually, I might even just show it here because it's easier to see on this page. So this highlighted section here, that's the fully digested version of a link. And it's really almost completely unreadable. If you click on it, depending on the browser, it will resolve to some version of a page that looks somewhat like this. But then if you post it in different places, every medium has its own rules of engagement about what a URL looks like. And to be specific, almost every accented link in Wikipedia breaks if you post it in Facebook, for example. You can get it to work, but you have to work around your elbow to get there. So that's a challenge that's going on these days. One I want to talk about that's actually an internal to Wikipedia challenge is kind of a combination of two issues. One of them is William Van Hoonard mentioned this in 2004. I found, I didn't have a name for it until very recently. Biographical zoning, where a person is known in some circumstance, but is not known in some other circumstance. This is a Wikipedia article on Matthew Bullock, who was a National Assembly member in the United States, eventually pioneered during the 10-year crusade. And when I started, this article already existed, but when I started, oh, my page is stuck. When I started, there we go. It took a while to load now because there's so much there. When I started, come on, browser. I'm losing control here. I don't know if I can get there. Oh, it's starting to move. Come on. My computer is trudging along here. A little bit more. I want to cover this because I want you to see the difference. And you're seeing the difference in terms of hundreds of sources that are about him. But when I started, when it's getting there, it was all about his 8 years in football, in American football. He was a player for 4 years and a coach for about 4 years. And that was the extent of his Wikipedia article. The fact that he had been in the civil service in different government structures in Massachusetts for 30, 40 years wasn't mentioned. The fact that he became a Baha'i and went abroad wasn't mentioned. He deserved a lot more time. This page is just, there it is. Oop, that was almost 100% of his original article. Just a list of football games and his winning and losing record in football. And you can get a sense from this gray button over here. This is a fraction of the page now, sources and written material, but there's a great deal more to his life now. Another one, but this leads to a challenge, which I'll just mention if I go all the way back to the top. This article got flagged. It doesn't meet the tone of Wikipedia sources. This lead section is too long for what they consider standard procedure. I'll expand on that a little bit. Another article that I did that people, I feel, addresses this kind of point of an obscure person who isn't really that obscure. This is an article I actually created, Nippo T. Strongheart. This is a American Indian, Native American, who did a variety of things over many years. This individual was brought to me by a Baha'i scholar who's no longer with us. And she knew the name, she knew that this person did things, but didn't really have, Stephen, can you find out any more about this person? And I did, and then I offered for that scholar to do the work of writing the article. And she said, no, you found the sources, you should write the article. Okay, so I wrote the article. But the fact that he was a Baha'i only comes in pretty well down the article, and he was only a Baha'i for a few years. But I tried to be balanced and tell his whole story, and there's a lot of story to tell. Now, this article didn't get challenged, but then there's another one here that I wrote that was, and this time I engaged the editor a little bit about it. Again, too many sources, indiscriminate material, what's going on here? This is a Civil War soldier who became a Baha'i. You probably all know the story of Thornton Chase, more or less. This was another Civil War soldier, but he knew Mark Twain. He's got paintings that are actually in museums these days, right now. He wrote some of the first coverage of railroad accidents as a journalist. He did drawings that are actually included in some of those old coverage that happened back in the day. I'm limited to the quality of the picture, by the way. I don't have any good pictures. But the editor, I posted this article, and this was great, as from my point of view. But other people thought, hey, this is too messy, what's going on? Well, again, in Wikipedia, you can talk about things. So there's a talk page, and he starts with, well, what's going on with this article? This needs a serious amount of editing going on. But I engaged him in a conversation, and we start talking about, how do we know what's a good article? What's good information to include? This, what I'm calling biographical zoning now. I didn't have the term when I was using this. But also, Wikipedia wants a summary approach to information, not all the details. But the practical way that works is you find sources and you summarize the sources. And if somebody's written a biography, you can't copy, that's plagiarism, you just copy. So you've got to summarize in some mechanical, there's a process right there that you're going to summarize this information. Another rule of Wikipedia is no original work. So the fact that I've just described him as a painter with paintings in museums right now, or that he knew Mark Twain and published about Mark Twain, or all these details that I'm just summarizing for you right now, I have to make those points. There's no published biography of Mr. Mills. So I can't just quote somebody saying that that's true. I have to go point by point saying, this is true, this is true, this is true. And then I can say, here's a summary statement. Well, that's a contradiction, right? I have to be detailed in order to make the summary, because there's no one else who summarized the detail, but I have to summarize and not be so detailed. So the fellow on the talk page eventually sort of came up to a stop and said, well, I know that there's a process, but I don't know what it is, so I'll stop. So that's an ongoing challenge that still needs to be figured out. What does Wikipedia want to do about information that's about art, people who deserve an article, but then you have no simple way to summarize the sources. And that's kind of it for my presentation, unless I missed something, or if anybody had an obvious question, or if we want to go ahead and transition to the question and answer part of this discussion.
Thank you, Stephen. That was a great overview of your work. 40,000 edits in Wikipedia and 50,000 newspaper articles clipped, and hundreds of articles written in Bahaipedia and Wikipedia. It's a tremendous amount of work over maybe 3 decades or more.
15 years, 15 years.
Okay. It looks like 3 decades worth of work.
Maybe 20, 20, something. Yeah,
Okay.
whatever, 2005.
I was dating it back to that 92 article. That's
Oh, yes.
you can't get away that easily. It's quite a while. But thank you so much. It's been such an insight into the work you're doing, and the back end of Wikipedia work that you and others are doing. So thank you for doing that, and doing it in a way that those of us who aren't doing that work could understand it and be with you, feel for what you're going through. So you did it very, very well. Thank you so much. So now the opportunity exists for some questions, but also there are some people on the call who know Steven's work, and maybe there are things that you think he was a little humble about, or could have highlighted a little more. So if there's anybody else who wants to share about his work, you can do that as well, in addition to the questions from those of us who are coming to it for the first time. So who would like to make a start? Jonah, who would like to make a start?
I just wanted to acknowledge the incredible amount of work that people like Steven and David Hassel have done. People don't realize how much work goes into making all these articles for Wikipedia and Bahaipedia. It's basically the two of you have written the equivalent of dozens of books just from the two of you, and you're among the most prolific authors and writers on the Baha'i faith. So to both of you and others who I'm sure I'm forgetting, thank you. Your work is appreciated.
Thank you. I will say that there's another Wikipedia editor goes by the name Jeff 3000, and believe it or not, I'm just catching up to him. But a significant portion of what he wrote was on totally other things that had nothing to do with the Baha'i faith. So the Baha'i content, I'm probably ahead of him. But there are several other editors who've done a tremendous amount of work. Wiki UK, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Quanado, or Quadanado 19 is the same person. They're all present. At this point, there's kind of 3 to 5 very active Wikipedia editors, contributors at this point. Over the lifetime of the project, just loosely speaking, maybe 50 people have contributed. I'm just your visible presence of a much larger body of work. I have done a significant portion myself, but there's a lot of other people that have done a lot of things.
Bill.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that Steven was very helpful when we were working here in the DC area on doing a gravesite marker for Pocahontas Pope, who was the first African-American Baha'i in Washington, DC. And the story of her life, her burial in the Columbian Harmony Cemetery, and then the sale of that cemetery to a developer, and the moving of 30,000 basically graves of African Americans whose gravestones were desecrated by being turned into waste along the Potomac. It's a major project now to recover those gravestones. And so we erected a marker, and Steven did a lot to help with the history of her life. And I think that there's a lot more to discover. And frankly, it wouldn't surprise me if at some point a full-length biography gets written of her and her husband. The other person that I'm planting a seed right now, Steven, Eulalia Barrow Bobo.
I have come across the name many times.
We need more information on her. She was a force of nature and a great teacher of the faith, and she brought most of the members of the Abercrombie family in South Carolina into the faith.
Okay, I'm certain that I've collected at least a dozen, maybe more, newspaper clippings about her traveling back and forth across the United States and giving talks. And I'm sure more can be found.
Right. And basically what I'm saying here is that this kind of work is discovering the lost life stories of important Baha'is who, because they were not part of the majority, were ignored. And the life of indigenous, African American, Japanese American, Oriental. I mean, we're at the anniversary of the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II. So all of these, there are Baha'is among those people who really were important in the growth of the faith, and too much we are ignorant of those. So I think this is really important work, is the just digging up of all this stuff and having it kind of pop out of the woodwork, so to speak, and saying, oh my goodness, And I appreciate very much your finding the British papers that were referring to 20,000 to 30,000 killed, because needless to say, there was a lot of back and forth in the 80s about, well, how many Bobbies were really killed in this the so-called academic literature. And as though Shoghi Effendi sort of made this up out of whole cloth. Well, it came from somewhere. And so if these sources are wrong, maybe they were, who knows? But these were the sources that were available. And the fact that we don't know those were sources is really important for us to find. So Stephen, keep up the good work.
Thank you. And I totally agree. I was going to try to find an example of one, sort of the most recent example of something like that raised eyebrows and said, really? I didn't know that. It will take me a minute. So go ahead with another question or ideas at the moment while I look for this. Everybody's waiting. All right, here we go. I've got so many clippings, it takes a while to find things. So this was a newspaper clipping, and there's a story to finding this newspaper clipping. The story is a non-Baha'i editor in Wikipedia made an article about, I don't even have her listed in the top part here. May C, I think it's Hannes, something like that. And I'd never heard of this name, and I was like, oh, citation, oh, okay. And the one citation that she was a Baha'i actually points to BahaiTeachings.org, an article that Chris Buck did. And I thought I'd go looking for the name, see if I could find anything more. And this was one of the articles that popped up. Let me zoom in a bit here. I don't know if you can read it. I'm only going to show a little bit of it, but you might be able to make out right here. And now it's catching up with me. Can you see the name? It's a little fuzzy, but Mrs. Sutherland Maxwell. When I was reading this article, and I'd gone over and over, and about half the article is just a list of names, and I was like, well, let me look. And Louis Gregory popped out to me down here, and Dr. Elaine Locke popped out to me, and then some other famous people, Miss Ovington, Weldon Johnson is famous, Du Bois is famous. The person who wrote the article, or the name, her name is up here somewhere. May C. Hawes, this name right here, is the person who started this whole search. And there's got to be more people in this name. How many times can you see 3 or 4 Baha'is in one place at one time? And someone then pointed out to me that Mrs. Sutherland Maxwell was in the list too. And I was like, oh, wow, there's something going on here. And this was 1929 in New York. And as far as I know, this isn't written up anywhere yet. So there's some event going on here. And then I looked up this Princess Jacques de Broglie. I don't know how to pronounce that. And she wrote an article that's in Baha'i World. She was praising the Baha'is. She was not a Baha'i, but she wrote an article praising the Baha'is. So there's another connection. And here she is playing piano. How did the French pianist Princess come to the United States and do a performance at which a lot of African Americans attended in somebody's home, by the way? This is 290 Convent Avenue in New York. And 100-ish people come, and I don't know, maybe 10 Baha'is, at least 5 are directly involved. This is brand new. This is less than a month old. So the work is always ongoing. I think somebody's got their hand raised. Steve Kolins.
Steve, yeah, Steve, you got your hand up. Thanks.
Yeah, one observation and a question, Stephen. Just all of those newspaper clippings, have you got them kind of stored and cached anywhere? Because should you stop paying your newspaper.com subscription, or you vanish from the face of the earth, what will happen to those 50,000 newspaper clippings? Because I would quite like them.
Right.
Have you got them stored anywhere? And then there's copyright, and are you allowed to cache them and whatever? So how do we solve that problem?
I don't have a solution, but I have some information. So I mentioned this other scholar who brought me the story of Nipoti Strongheart. She was another clipper in newspapers.com herself. Her stuff is still there. So the clippings actually stay, even though you're not paying for continuing, whatever. So that's good. And like I said, they overcame the link rot problem of changing the edition, and then the thing went away. However, there is no coherent effort on my part to search for things in that 50,000 clippings. I desperately want to, and think a really good, even an AI search engine should be involved, and somehow collate and find the links, and these names are linked with each other, and then link those with Baha'i News and Baha'i World, get all that clustered together, and we might find a lot of interesting connections. I have occasionally voiced the idea that to them, like a download all button would be nice. They said it was a tremendous idea, but then I haven't heard anything more of it since then. I've talked with the idea of using some kind of script process to walk the clippings in my page, or there's a few other Baha'is that have done clippings. Download them manually one at a time. That thousands is a lot to do, so I manually is kind of out of the question. I'm open to solutions. I want to do something. I've even offered to the fact that I know that the Wikipedia process, the newspapers.com process, when you get your clipping, all the links in the attachment go back to newspapers.com. I think that's fine. I don't know what their rules of copyright are beyond that, but as far as a downloadable research collection that the click goes back to their website, I think that makes them okay. So I'm completely open to any ideas about how to get all these downloaded. And then there's the problem of there's things beyond Wikipedia, newspapers.com. Every state in the country, every province in Australia, in Canada, there's some place where there's a place to get more. I specifically built out of a California collection that's public. I gathered, I'm thinking that it's on the order of 2,000 clippings that cover the history of the before Bosch, the Geyserville, thank you, the Geyserville Baha'i School from 1925-ish to 1980-ish, whatever, 2,000 newspaper clippings, because the local newspaper of the town published a lot about what the Baha'is did. names of people coming and going. It's a rich source of names.
Sure.
It all deserves to be downloaded and something done with it.
Okay. Well, do they have? Well, we can maybe have a conversation ourselves some other time. Second, an observation I would make is you quoted The Guardian about what looks like a vision of a planetary kind of internet, 1936.
Yep.
In actual fact, there's a curious book called Coming of the Glory by a woman called Florence Pynchon, who lived in Haifa during the time of The Guardian and wrote a book. And half the book is the central figures plus Shoghi Effendi. And then the latter part of the book is kind of it's a utopian romance, I guess, as a story. And it's called A Glimpse of the Golden Age. And it's quite interesting. It talks about factories and houses of justice and what their sources of revenue are and how people live and how short the working day is and all this kind of stuff. But on page 121, and this is a book that Shoghi Effendi bought, I think he bought 100 copies of the book. He's quoted in the forward as reviewing the book. So he's kind of a proxy for writing the book. So she would have got her information from him. And on page 121, there's mention of this internet. It basically says, imagine that the story starts out as a sort of a picnic of a group of 4 young people, and they get swept up into a kind of a worldwide drone device, and they manage to sort of visit parts of the earth. And one of those 4 participants has a scientific kind of basis, and a scientific, this is the quoting the one paragraph, and a scientific friend who in these matters was far keener than the rest of us exclaimed at a kind of invisible network of communication, swift as light, more perfect than radio, that covered the earth from pole to pole, transmitting not only sound but form and color. So this is, to me, this is an even earlier, Shoghi Effendi through this lens of this Florence Pynchon, imagining this global brain. Yeah.
What was the year of that?
2028.
28. Ah, cool. Very good.
So yeah, I just thought you'd be interested in that, because it is, for me, it's like, wow, this is the Guardian being reflected in Florence's kind of visionary. The whole chapter is quite fascinating. Yeah. But anyway, I thought you might enjoy that.
That is cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, you got a third thing.
Well, I got a third thing now that I think about it. So
go ahead.
For me, the main Wikipedia is problematic because of the crazy rules, the bots, the contest, the tensions that come and go, the unreliability of a page. But I do like the project, the Baha'i version of that. And if someone could somehow start to figure out what are the gaps, what needs to be placed in there, that could be built out as a go-to place for Baha'i material, for it's sort of an encyclopedia effectively. I know it's already well underway, but that's where I would put my energy if I had time to do stuff. The main Wikipedia seems deeply fraught to me. I don't know what your thoughts are.
I feel strongly about the same issues. I will say that in 2019, I was going to go to one of these Baha'i-inspired schools and do a weekend seminar on, not specifically on Wikipedia, but doing historical research for individuals, for their own research, family history, whatever it was they wanted to do. And then I was going to point them to Bahaipedia as a place where they could write their article and build a storyline. If they can get a narrative of newspapers and Baha'i references, this kind of thing, they could build something. And then I was going to talk about in that class, for those of you that I feel can write a college paper where you cite things and you're careful about how you cite things and you respect the sources, this is the kind of work that goes into Wikipedia. And the skills, the mechanical skills in Bahaipedia are very close to the skills you need to write in Wikipedia. So there's definitely We absolutely need it. One of the things I'll say, I've done this work with Nippo, Strongheart, and all these people that haven't been known that nobody knew about. And Bill mentioned Pocahontas Pope. For every mountain that I have unearthed, there is a mountain range that remains to be unearthed. There are thousands of individuals out of the millions of Baha'is present and have ever lived. There are at least thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands who made a difference in their hometown, who made a difference in other people's lives and wrote about it. And we think that's all gone. And I'm telling you, it's coming back. And these stories can be told and need to be told. And the skills necessary to find these stories need to be figured out. And the materials, my library where I work, my day job, they occasionally publish, yes, we've published 600 terabytes of new material in the last 5 years. And they're scanning things all over the place, statewide newspapers and yearbooks, high school yearbooks. The oldest Baha'i of North Carolina is still alive. Became a Baha'i in 1945, and I could find his yearbook picture, his high school yearbook picture. That's really cool. The first Baha'i of North Carolina seems to have become a Baha'i around 1918, 1919. And her father, I can find back into the 1870s. A Black teacher, well, he did many things, but he was a teacher of a school, and nailed to his school was a predictably lamentable comment, which made the newspaper. So these stories can be told and recovered and made strong again, not just family heritage that children will remember, but we should all take note of. This actually happened, that kind of stuff. Anyway, I'm going on and on.
Well, Stephen, thank you for that. I think we've come to the end of the session for this time around. Thank you all for being part of this session this morning or this evening. And we look forward to seeing you again next weekend.